Hello, quilters, and welcome back. We're moving right along with our sampler quilt. We're now up to block 8, and block 8 is this cute little block called Texas Circle Around by Lynn Roddy Brown. And it may look very familiar to you. We've got several blocks of different names that look a lot like this, but I like the fact that with this one, Lynn has chosen to make it look like a scrappy block. And so we're going to construct this one. No templates needed. I'm going to talk a little bit about sewing squares together to make half square triangles. But other than that, the construction is pretty much straightforward. So let's look at the cutting directions. And you can see that it calls for lights and darks. And so the first set of cutting directions are for assorted dark fabrics. And you can see that they're in the corners and they are along the side. And then it calls for shapes that you cut from assorted light fabrics. And those shapes tend to mirror the ones that you cut for the dark fabrics. And you see the little symbol where you see a diagonal drawn through a square. That indicates that we're going to be cutting some squares, sewing them together, and then making half square triangles out of them. And as we go through the construction directions, you'll see exactly when I do that. Those are necessary for the corners in this block. Now, as you look at what you're supposed to cut, and they don't call them strips, they call them rectangles. You've got rectangles running along the side of the block. Here are the first set of rectangles, the second set of rectangles, third set of rectangles, and the fourth set of rectangles. Now these pieces are C's and D's. And the C rectangle, which is the one here in the middle, is cut 1 7/8 by 4.5 inches. And then these two rectangles, these are the D's, they are cut 1 7/8 inches. So once again, my suggestion to you is to cut a strip of fabric across the width of your fabric, 1.5 inches wide, and then you can cut your rectangles if you don't mind them all being cut from the same fabric. But if you want to do as the creator of the block has done, and you want all of your rectangles to be different, then of course that won't work, and you'll just cut all of these little strips out of different fabrics. But please note that 2 D's are in each set of strips, and they are different size than the C that's in the middle. And we'll talk about that in a little while when I show you what I have cut. Here on the table are the squares that I've cut. And I've stacked each of the corner squares because in each instance, I have to sew these two squares together. And I'll get into how we do that. You know, we put a line here, and then we stitch on 1/4 of an inch on either side of that line. And the original line is our cutting line. And I'll demonstrate that as we put these together. I don't have my strips in the middle for you to see because I want you to see what I've done. I want all of mine to be exactly alike around the block. So I multiplied 4.5 times 4, and that means I needed 18 inches. So I cut a strip of fabric for the 2 D's, that is 18 1/4 inches long, and I cut a strip of fabric for the C that's in the middle, that's 18 1/4 inches long. And I'm going to cut these into 4.5 inch lengths and put each one where it should be. and I'll demonstrate that. Cutting 4.5 inches from my strip because I know that each of these has to be 4.5 inches. And because I want all 4 of them to be the same as they travel around the quilt, the quilt block. So I didn't cut a lot of different little rectangles. Once again, I cut strips that were 18 and 1/4 inches long. And I got that number because 4 times 4.5 is 18 inches. And I added the 1/4 just in case. Don't think I need it, but it's just good to have. And so now I'm cutting this. I sewed the 3 strips together. Now I'm cutting them into the 4.5 inch lengths that I need them to be. And yeah, you can see I've got a little extra here, and that's fine. I would much rather have this little extra than to not have enough. That will go into a scrap pile and eventually get into a scrap quilt, which makes it so much better for what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I can put my corners back. This block has a center square that's 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and it has these corner squares. And now here are my rectangles to go in these spaces. And so basically, here is my block all laid out. Once again, this is a D and this is a D. And these are 1 and 7/8 inches wide. And the C is 1 and 3/4 inches wide. And when I hold the cutting directions up for you again, you will see that. And so the next thing I want to do is demonstrate how we are going to handle these squares in the corners. Here is our square with which I'm working. And the directions tell us that I need to sew the white square and the African fabric square together to make these half square triangles in the corner. See if you can see that. Bring it a little closer. But you can see here that we've got some half square triangles in the corner. And so many of you know how to do this, and this is just a little refresher on sewing these to make those. First thing we want to do is get ourselves a place of orientation, and I've got a smaller ruler to handle. And I need to cut this on the vertical. Yes, eventually I'll cut this on the vertical. So I'm going to draw a line from one corner to the next, and I want it to be as accurate as possible. And I'm drawing on the wrong side of the fabric. And there, you can see the line that I have drawn. Now, eventually, that will be our cutting line. So, in order to know the distance from which to cut that, I'm going to measure 1/4 of an inch from that line on either side. And the lines that I'm drawing now are our stitching lines. That's one side, and I decided not to make it a solid line. I want it different from the cutting line, so I just made it a dashed line. And now let me get the other one on here. And this is how you will treat the squares in all 4 corners. We have our cutting line, which is the solid line down the middle. And then we have our 2 stitching lines, 1/4 of an inch from the cutting line. And when I go to the sewing machine, I'm going to stitch on both sides of the cutting line, that 1/4 of an inch uh, line that's a dash line. That's where I will stitch. And once I get that done, I'll show it to you. Here is our square sewn, well, the two squares. I have the beige sewn to the African fabric, and I have sewn them exactly where I said I would, right on the slash lines that I made. Hope you can see the stitches. Now I need to cut them apart on that middle line, and I'm going to do that with my rotary cutter. You may want to use scissors, and that's absolutely fine. I just find that the rotary cutter works better for me. And you can see I'm lining up my ruler on that middle line that I have drawn. And now I can cut them apart. And the next thing would be to go to the ironing board and press them. Oh, I don't know why I did that. Just put a new blade in here. Okay. And so here is one, and here is another. Now, in your cutting directions, it says you will have four, let's see, how does it write? You'll have 4 extras for another block, and you will if all of your corners are different, because you're going to get 8 cuts and you only have 4 corners. So keep that in mind. In my case, all of my corners are exactly alike. So I really only have to sew 2 sets, cut them in half, and I have the 4 corners that I need. So I won't have any extras. But you need to be aware of that. If your corners are all going to be different, you are going to have sets of the corners that you don't use. And because each one of these makes 2 when you cut them apart. Right now I'm going to take mine to the ironing board, press the seam allowance, and show you that. Now you can see my 4 corners. And since I have a light fabric and a dark fabric, I pressed the seam allowances toward the darker fabric. And you can play with this, you know, any way you want. I looked at the corners this way, and then I thought, no, that gets really busy. Even though that pink is in the square in the middle, still, I'm not so sure that I like that as well as I like this. But you're going to arrange yours exactly the way you want, which is the neat thing about quilting anyway. We take someone else's idea and customize it to our own thinking and make it ours. And so there is the block essentially, and the white does break up some of what's going on here with the African fabrics. But I think I really like that. And here is the construction chart. I didn't say much about that because these are the only directions you get, and there are no directions for putting those half square triangles together. And so I wanted to share that with you because now my block on the table looks just like what's depicted in the construction picture. So we're now ready to sew rows together. And in this picture, you can see the bottom row has been sewn together. The middle row has been sewn together. And now they're ready to sew the top row together. And I'm about to do the same thing. Here is my bottom row. Here is my middle row. And here is my top row. And I need to go to the sewing machine and sew these 3 pieces together. these three pieces together, these three together, and I'll have 3 rows completed. And then it will be a matter of sewing row 3 to row 2, and then row 2 to row 1, and the block will be completed. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine, complete the sewing that I need to do now, and then show you what the block looks like. Here's our block laid out. I've sewn the bottom row together, I've sewn the middle row together, and I've sewn the top row together, and I've pressed the seam allowances. And just a little note, when you have a block such as this, press the seam allowances on the middle row in one direction. In this case, I pressed them in so that they will nestle with the 2 rows on either side if you press those seam allowances out. So that when I get ready to sew these together, there'll be less bulk because one seam allowance is going in that direction and the other seam allowance is going in this direction. And the same thing is going to happen down here. This seam allowance is going out and this seam allowance is going in, so that they will nestle together and I won't have a lot of bulk where the seam allowances come together. Okay, I'll sew these the last 2 seams, these horizontal seams, and we will have our finished block. Now we have our completed block. You can see it here on the table. Love this little block, a little busy. And the fabrics, of course, by being together, add a lot of drama. I love the yellow gold going around. I really like the way that stands out. And then encased in the dark green. I like the connection between the center square and the corners. And I tried to do a little bit of fussy cutting for these corners because I wanted that same wavy design in each of the corners, and I pretty much got that. So this is block 8. Texas circle go round. Circle around. I shouldn't have said goes. Texas circle around. And here is our construction sheet. And I think we've pretty much followed the directions that are there. And once again, if you want a block such as mine with the strips or rectangles as they're called, all the same on either side, then you can just cut strips of fabric that are 18 inches long. For the D's, you need a strip of fabric that's 36 inches long because you need twice as much. And the yellow gold is 18 inches. I added a 1/4 of an inch just to make sure I had a little wiggle room. If you want all of your rectangles to be different as they are here, then of course you're going to follow the cutting directions as they're given and cut each rectangle out separately, because each of these rectangles has been cut from a separate piece of fabric. There are no 2 rectangles alike on here. So you would have all of those to cut out individually. Then remember, you're going to cut 2 squares for each corner, unless your squares are all on your corners are going to be exactly the same. Then you only need 2 of each because you'll cut them in half and you'll get all 4 corners that way. Those are some design decisions that you will want to make as you look at your fabrics. Usually fabrics tell you what to do. If you just listen to them and do what they say, you usually get a pretty good product, a pretty attractive product. So look at your fabrics, let your fabrics tell you what you're going to add and where. If you are using African fabrics, as I am, I do hope you're using some kind of neutral to help tone things down and help the fabrics that are in there shine. And this is an example of how these fabrics work together, because if you look on the color wheel, red and green are right there beside each other, and then yellow. So we've got some fabrics that work together based on the color wheel. And we've got this beige fabric in there to tone some things down. And ultimately, we've got a very pretty block. Now, I had told you in the introductions that I am making two of each block, and this one is no exception. Here is my other block from Texas Circle Around. And I used the same fabrics. Just wanted to give myself a chance to see what would happen using the same fabrics in a different way each time for the same block. This one to me is a little busier, and I think it's because the beige is outside on the corners as opposed to inside here. And this center is so dramatic. That whirly swirly green and blue is much more dramatic than the red one that looks like it has a shield on it. Using this yellow in the corners and in the middle bars also creates some drama. And the yellow fabric has blue and red in it, and they swirl. So that tends to give it some movement along with the center square swirling. So nice block. I like the block. I like both of them. Can't say I like one more than the other. Just excited to see both of them in the quilt ultimately. So this is block 8, Texas Circle Go Round. I'll hold the cutting directions up for you as I always do. Happy quilting, and I will see you soon for block 9.